Good evening. This is Seth Morgan. We're hoping that you are well and your family's well. As before, we are coming back again to do another podcast, but we're going to follow up on what we were actually talking about the other day. And I know I may have said that I concluded, but you really can't conclude on this type of information because it's so important. And what I want you to understand is that oftentimes, we always say that we're not a monolith. But I kind of beg to differ with a lot of people who often say, that we're not monolithic in terms of how we do things. And, of course, everybody's not the same and we do things differently. But we're going to get back into what we were talking about in terms of the African nations and some very interesting things that are happening with the UN Security Council, where, of course, that the 49 nations were just in the U.S. with a summit with President Biden and many other leaders for 3 days. Okay, so what I would like to say, amongst many things, as far as not being monolithic and things that we do or how we approach different things, I have to disagree. Because I think that we're very monolithic in the things that we do and how a lot of our people approach things and how we act, whether they be in small societies, whether they be in small circles, in regards to narratives that deal with, our youngsters. And I have to admit that it does differ some, but there's a large majority of our people who espouse to a certain way in how we live. And you can find that in lower tiers. You can find that in higher tiers of society where you see, you just take for instance, the Kyrie saga. You take, for instance, the situation with Kanye, and you say that we're not a monolith. When we look at how we treat our people, and this is why we're so fragmented. This is why we're so divided, and I don't always want to come and be the bearer of bad news, but you have to tell the truth. You have to tell the truth and look at the things the way they are, and so when we look at people who are well-to-do and have a greater station in life as far as financially, and they're out in the front and they're noticed and they have a great deal of notoriety, just look how we treat one another. We'll throw one another under the bus in a minute, but we say we're not a monolith. And I beg to differ that in a lot of ways we are. We are. Because you take the youngsters in the hood and how they're going around and they're shooting up one another and then we look at religious leaders and we say, okay, what are they doing in our communities? Why is this still happening if in fact there's so much power in the church? Why are our communities toe up? So monolithically, you have the preachers for the most part, I'm talking about black preachers, and I'm talking about, you can say white ones too, but for the most part, you got a large majority of them who do things the same way. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is they open up their doors every Sunday, they collect money, they get the women all excited, they'll throw out some things and people will jump up and down and people get excited. And then when it's all said and done, you have a certain segment who are going back to the suburbs, and then you have another segment who are going in a different direction where there may not be a large amount of monitoring in their communities as it relates to safety, how the police are dealing with our people, how the municipalities are functioning in our communities, and so forth. And is there any real activism? Most of the activism in the communities are coming from grassroots, from regular people. They're coming from regular people. They're not coming from people who are wielding the power. They're not coming from ministers and preachers who are collecting the money on Sundays. They're not coming from them. They're coming from people who are on the lower tier of society. Okay? And you may find somewhere, or maybe on a middle class, or maybe not so middle class level, where they may be involved. But when we start talking about the upper tier of well-to-do individuals, they don't have time for that. Okay, so now, how is the U.S. dealing with the continent? And how is this going to affect what's happening globally? Okay, now just recently, I don't know whether or not you've heard, because now the U.S. is creating a multilateral platform with the continent, with the African nations, in which they haven't done before. Because in times past, the way they were dealing with the continent was basically unilateral. And what that means, that just means maybe a couple of nations, that they would deal with, and Africa was shut out. So now there's a multilateral consensus in the way in which the continent is approaching, the way in which the U.S. is approaching the African nations. And why is that? Why is that? I think you know why it is. It's because they need the continent. They need those resources. And I've said this before. So now there's a great push now that after all this time that the African nations have been guests at the table with the G20 and so forth, and the EU, now they're talking about making several African nations member states. See, but the African nations and the continent at large has to be very, very careful, because you already know that the U.S. never does anything without trying to have some sort of an advantage. And this is why I just said they were dealing with the continent in a unilateral way in times past. They never got anything really done. There was a lot of stuff that was talked about. There may have been some things put on paper, but it was never followed up. It was never worked through where it became intentional in the way in which you had tangible evidence of things that were happening, maybe on a lower scale. But now the U.S. is talking about investing billions of dollars in the continent. The continent, certain nations are going to become member states of the UN and so forth and so on. And they're going to become a part of the EU, G20, so forth and so on. But I would say that they have to be very, very careful because as we speak right now, the EU, the EU is trying to hold Trinidad, Tobago, and a few other smaller Caribbean nations and surrounding nations. They're blacklisting them, meaning that they're saying that the way in which their taxes are being done is not following protocol the way the EU wants them to. It's the nerve of these people. Seeing what they're trying to do. So, but at the same time, you have countries like Switzerland and all these other European nations who don't follow the same tax codes. But yet they're trying to hold Trinidad, Jamaica, Tobago, and all these other countries saying, okay, we're going to put pressure on you, we're going to blacklist you, and we're going to make it hard for you. We're going to make it hard for you to do business when it comes time for you guys to get money. So that you're not able to bolster your economies the way you need to. So it's a power play, and it's a way in which they want to control these nations, which they have in the past. But then, of course, you have a lot of these nations now that are independent, and they are not under colonial rule anymore, and so it's yet to be seen. So we'll see, but. I just want to go over some things, but I want you to pay attention to what's going on because you have to know, as I said before, you have to know that what happens in the continent and what is happening around the globe right now with the EU and all these European nations, they're going through tremendous deficits. And as I said before, you got countries like France, Germany, Belgium. You got Switzerland. You name it. A lot of these countries are going through. Their economies are not doing as well as you may think they're doing. And as a matter of fact, you have a lot of African countries right now that are doing much better in terms of their GDP growth, better than a lot of these European countries. And the only way these European countries are actually still staying solvent and surviving is because of the continent. And so it's a game. It's a game of chess, obviously. It's a game of chess. And they have to keep their country solvent. And they have to figure out ways and how that we can get the best out of these people and give them less. Let me just read something here. The bloc of 3 elected African states on the United Nations Security Council, known as the A3, has grown considerably in stature and diplomatic capacity since the creation of the African Union, the AU, in 2002, and the beginning of the partnership between it and the UN, although African issues have not traditionally been contentious in the Security Council. Increasing geopolitical tensions among council members are starting to spill over onto these files, much to the detriment of collective political action. If the A3 bloc wants to ensure its relevance and influence in 2020 and beyond, Africa will need to ensure that unified positions are at the core of its approaches. And as I said, it's a game. See, and the game is we can't allow Africa to grow exponentially, the continent to grow exponentially to a point where you don't need us. And see, this is what's going on. Most of the nations in the continent are on a quest to be totally solvent and independent, where they don't have to deal with the United States, France, Germany, and see, what you have to understand is they need the continent more than the continent really needs them. But then again, of course, it's a two-way street, and the thing is, and I mentioned this before. The thing is this: when you weaken the dollar of other nations, even though with them having the resources, you can have the resources, but if your dollar is weak and your infrastructure is weak, okay, if your infrastructure is weak and your dollar is weak, your currency is weak, then you have to, like what they're doing now, you have to be somewhat dependent on these other nations for their currency to bolster your economy. And of course, the problem with that has always been that these nations, these European nations, have weakened the continent economic growth through famine, through poverty. Through you name it. And so this is what has to happen. These nations have to, which they're forming, and they're more together now. They have a coalition amongst themselves. And they know the games that these people play. So basically what's being said is, if we're not playing on an even playing field, there's going to be problems. We can't do business with we can't do business any longer with you casting us crumbs for our resources. We can't do business like that. It's not only is it not fair, it's blatant exploitation. Excuse me. So let's continue to read on a little bit here. And I want to give you a little something. And I think I read this to you before. I think I may have given you a little bit of before. Africa is numerically significant at the Security Council. You hear that? It's significant at the Security Council in 2018. Over 50% of Security Council meetings, 60% of its outcome documents, and 70% of its resolutions with Chapter 7 mandate concern African peace and security issues. Furthermore, African member states comprise nearly 28% of the UN's overall membership, 54 out of 193 members. Now, mind you, as I was telling you before, temporary members, right? Providing significant regional political backing to the A3, Niger, South Africa, and Tunisia are the African three members, the A3 members, same thing. In 2020, either Djibouti or Kenya will replace South Africa on the Security Council starting in January 2021, which they've already done. Okay? So, and it goes on to state on the UN Security Council, the African nations that have from year to year, because what happens is, as I was reading the other day and saying to you, that on this temporary membership, they have, they're on there for a certain amount of years, and then, like it was just saying, Djibouti and Kenya will replace South Africa starting January 2021. Okay, and so that's how they work it. So now they're going to have African nations who are going to become permanent members. But again, like I said, the continent has to be very careful in how this is structured and how they're going to be a voice on the Security Council, because, of course, they still have issues in certain nations with coups and people overthrowing governments and certain leaders not wanting to lead. I mean, because you've had African leaders who have been in office, believe it or not, some 30 years. Can you imagine that? Some of them have been in office for 30 years because they've been running their governments in a patriarchal system. In other words, they're passing, or matriarchal system, or however they do it. They're passing down the governments to their sons and to their daughters. And there's widespread corruption because these people don't want to leave. And when the people try to vote them out or get them out, then what they do is they use the military against them. They use the military against them. And it's a sad thing. And they have the countries ravaged and devastated through all this corruption, you know? And meanwhile, what's happening is the people are suffering. Despite spending much of its time on African issues, many Security Council members have previously treated them as marginal or less strategic. When compared with Syria, North Korea, or the Middle East peace process, as a result, African files, including many UN peacekeepers operations, have often avoided major concentration. I mean, just, you know, you look at countries like Libya, not long ago. You know, there was interference when the U.S. went in and took out Gaddafi. You know, and they made him to be a monster. However, intense negotiations on Libya and the Central African Republic earlier this year reflects the growing fault lines within the Security Council. The Council's 5 permanent members. Okay, here we go again. The Security Council's 5 permanent members. Remember? We talked about the other day. 5 permanent members. China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States are marred in a period of significant impasse, okay, and conflicting strategic interests, including between once strong allies. As a result, conflicting strategic interests that inhibit collective action in other parts of the world are now impacting the Security Council's engagements in Africa. You can't talk about war crimes in other countries and then you have them right over here in the U.S. And they're coming to you and they're saying, you know, help us out with what's going on in our country, but the U.S. has problems right here. There are war crimes that are committed in the U.S. I mean, anytime you see people, or you see, you know, military involvement, or you see police in the street, or military agents coming in communities during these protests with these military vehicles and weaponized armament, that's an act of war crimes. You know, when you're indiscriminately killing people in the street. And so it's hard for a nation to correct and try to create, you know, a platform of democracy in other countries when it's barely working here. Okay. In such context, the A3 bloc plays a critical role in shaping Security Council debates, breaking geopolitical deadlock, and guiding the Council's collective action. African unity is essential toward achieving these efforts. And this is what I'm saying. All roads leads back to the continent. As such, members can show such unity through a range of approaches. For example, they can issue joint statements to the Council, define joint negotiation positions for Council outcome documents, and convene joint press stakeouts to deliver key messages to the general public. The role played by the AU Permanent Observer Mission to the UN is of particular importance, as it can help to coordinate A3 and AU engagements, facilitate regular interactions with diplomats and officials in Addis Ababa, and retain institutional memory of both the AU and the UN. See, now what's going to be interesting is this. Of course, when these African nations become permanent members of the UN, how is that going to affect? See, because what we have to understand is that the AU is more interested in keeping foundational solvency for their own countries. So is there a ploy to have disruptive measures in some of the African nations, or most if they can, so that they keep the African nations coming and being in a posture of begging and in need, which some of the African leaders have said, we're not going to beg you guys. We have what you need. So we'll see. So we're going to pick up on this again. And we, of course, ask that you support us. We ask that you stay with us, that you continue to come on and listen to what we have for you, because we're going to always bring you content that matters. And we know that a lot of our people are not politically inclined, and they may not want to hear this. You may want to hear more something about somebody's dating on, Hollywood or something that really don't have no relevance. And, so we're trying to keep you abreast of what's going on. So again, support us, subscribe to what we're doing, and we'll be bringing you more podcasts. We're going to pick up on some more of this at some point, and we'll keep you abreast of the information and what's actually happening. And I'm guessing you'll be hearing on your own what is actually happening, because as I said before, and I'll keep saying, is that whatever happens in the continent affects the whole world. And so we have to be paying attention as to what's going on so that we can know what is actually happening. So we thank you for listening. Come back, support us, and we're going to be grateful. Go to our hashtag, drop something in there for us. And again, we'll be talking with you the next time. So have a great night. Okay, take care. Bye-bye. Remember to visit us, as always, on our host stations such as Podbean, Apple, Amazon, Google Play, so forth and so on, Spreaker, Amazon.com. Have a great night. Thank you. Bye-bye.